Thanks for coming, everyone. So just to provide a quick framing, in post-apartheid South Africa, the wealth and privileges of the beneficiaries of apartheid have been protected even after apartheid has ended through the de-racialization approach of the ANC. Only a tiny minority of blacks have entered into the capitalist class, often through connections to the state and the governing group. The current government of President Jacob Zuma is witness to major brawls between rival elite factions amidst growing corruption scandals. The historical alliance between the ANC, the South African Communist Party, and COSATU, the trade union, is fracturing. Protests and demonstrations calling for Zuma to resign are growing. Out of this ruin, a new South African working class movement may yet emerge. So with that, I introduce Eli Kodaseng, who has been involved in South African left politics and struggle for almost 30 years. He was a local and national organizer and educator in various COSATU unions, and then moved to Kanya College, a left NGO that provides support and political education for community and informal worker movements. He is currently organizing informal waste pickers and completing a master's in education and work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the wonderful warm welcome. And it's really great to see everyone, some old faces, some new ones. Met Kaya there from Johannesburg, Sandra. Thanks for welcoming me. A sense in which I'm not sure where to start, and I'm moving from the assumption that many of us are somewhat familiar with the history of South Africa, but I will touch briefly on it. A little bit about the history of the country, and then maybe begin to move on to some of the more current events and what, in my analysis, they represent and what they mean for the possible realignment of the left. I think the first thing I wanted to say is that on the 2nd of February 1990, the then president of South Africa, de Klerk, made a very significant and very important speech, which led to the unbanning of the ANC, the South African Communist Party, the Pan-Africanist Party, the AZAPO, and other political organizations. And the speech also set out a very important framework within which the country was supposed to move forward. There's a sense in which a lot of us, even us who live in South Africa, have sort of forgotten something about that was very significant about the speech. It was not just the fact that the apartheid state announced the unbanning of these political organizations. The speech also set out the core principles of what the apartheid state felt the future needs to look like. It set out about 32 core principles, which were essentially non-negotiables in relation to the ending of apartheid. And a lot of the principles that the speech set out had to do with the so-called protection of minorities. It had to do with the fact that the constitution going forward needed to guarantee the property clause, meaning that the black majority government that would eventually come in cannot expropriate any of the wealth that was accumulated under apartheid. It set out conditions such as the inclusion of the then Bantustan leaders. Now, Bantustans, for those who were not familiar with South African history, are those indigenous areas, so-called, that were set aside by the South African state, where black people were supposed to live, and they were all organized along ethnic lines. I think more or less, I suppose, in a way, similar to the reserves that the indigenous and the First Nations have been put into, both in Canada and also in America. But the difference in South Africa is that those so-called indigenous areas also had their own government, their own so-called government, police forces, armies. Some of them were so-called fully fledged states with presidents and cabinets. Some of them were semi-independent, meaning that they were still under so-called South African laws, but they basically had premiers and they were administered from Pretoria. So the speech basically essentially set out all of those 32 principles, which critically also included policies around economic policies that the apartheid state felt needed to be preserved. And basically, besides the fact that the speech set out protection of minorities, the inclusion of the black homeland leaders, which were very important in the sense that they were sections of the black community that had bought into the system, were essentially part of the apartheid administration and were used to justify the policy of separate development and apartheid, so they were to be brought in. And also, as I was saying, that the speech also set out parameters for the new economic policy for South Africa. And some of the principles basically with regards to economic policy basically emphasize that any new state that's going to arise needs to take cognizance of the importance of fiscal discipline. It needs to take into account the need for privatization of state-owned enterprises. Essentially, it set out a vision for structural adjustment for South Africa. Now, obviously, the speech itself, although people welcomed the unbanning of political organizations, however, there were a lot of reactions within the anti-apartheid movement internally about all of these preconditions. But I think through a series of compromises, in particular, the ANC essentially agreed to a lot of the key principles by the time the new constitution was formed. One of the most critical compromises that the ANC had agreed to, or the positions that they had agreed to, was the fact that there was initially unanimity within the liberation movements, within both that were coming in from exile and those organizations that were within the country that were struggling against apartheid. There had been unanimity over the fact that that the constitution itself needs to be drawn up by a democratically elected government, which meant that all that needed to be negotiated with the apartheid state were how elections were going to be held, when they were going to be held, and the elected representatives of the people were the ones that were going to negotiate the constitution. And the ANC also finally agreed, then caved in on that proposal, leading to sections of the anti-apartheid organizations walking out of the negotiation process. For example, the Pan-Africanist Congress walked out of the negotiation process, protesting over this. So essentially what happened is that the constitution was negotiated between the anti-apartheid movement and an illegitimate government. And in setting out parameters for the constitution, they agreed to a lot of issues such as the independence of the Reserve Bank, which meant that monetary policy could not really be determined and organized by a democratic government. There were clauses there that guaranteed the protection of so-called minorities, the clauses that protected the wealth that had been accumulated by the South African ruling class. So all of those key elements that were found in the speech by de Klerk in 1990 managed to find their way into the constitution. So by the time 1994 came and people basically went in and elected the new democratic government, the parameters of what South Africa is going to look like were already set in stone, so to speak. And those principles essentially still govern the country. So there's a sense in which the vision that the apartheid state had set out in terms of what the state needs to look like, the kinds of economic policies that it needed to have, the kind of social policies it needed to be had, all of those were essentially incorporated well before the elections happened. And I think that this background, in a way, sort of begins to explain I think the sense of, for lack of a better term, the sense of betrayal that you find within, I think, large sections, particularly of the working class community in the country, and also, I should say, within the black middle classes, because what the Constitution did was to set up a series of protections for big businesses, for the ruling classes in the country. They had a reserve bank that could determine economic policy. They had laws protected by the Constitution that prevented expropriation of wealth. They had agreed, there had been agreement. We then discovered, I think later also, on a range of other economic policy measures, I think that we agreed to with the ANC and particularly the Communist Party before even the negotiations actually started. And so there's a sense in which South Africa that we find today is a South Africa that was crafted well before apartheid, actually the formal end of apartheid, and that the economic and the political policies were actually put into place at that point in time. Now, I just wanted to also talk about the fact that I wanted to look at the post-1994 period up to the present and divide it into sort of two broad areas. From 1994, with the election of a democratic government in South Africa, there was a lot of contestation from within the anti-apartheid movement with the ANC and the forces of the left that were also not in the ANC, about not having lost, I think, some of the battles around the Constitution and some of the provisions that we agreed to. There were a lot of battles that were fought around the economic policy in particular, around the orientation that the country needed to take, notwithstanding the fact that you had an independent reserve bank that was guaranteed in the institution, in the Constitution. There was some agreement within what was then called the mass democratic movement about an economic orientation that was essentially social democratic in nature. That policy came to be called the Reconstruction and Development Program, which basically called for a process of internal industrialization through the provision of basic services, building of houses, building of hospitals, health centers, etc., schools, and using local materials, raising money internally, and basically using that kind of policy as a basis on which to basically ensure the protection of jobs, to ensure the continuation of the economy, and also to ensure, I think, that already what was already beginning to happen in the 1990s, the processes of industrial restructuring that the apartheid state, together with big capital, were embarking upon, which were leading to large numbers, thousands and thousands of workers losing their jobs. And this process actually of job losses and restructuring continued all the way from the 1990 and I think continued all the way up to I could argue up to the present. And South Africa, as a result, I think has not only is it one of the most unequal societies in the world, with very, very, very wide differences between the richest and the poorest, but that also the process of deindustrializing South Africa, when the country formally, I think finally agreed on the ANC, as you say, not the country. The ANC finally adopted a structural adjustment program that they called GEAR, ironically something along the lines of growth, equity and redistribution, which was thrown in somewhere, but in reality it was a process of, it was a thoroughly neoliberal policy of structural adjustment that led to the closure of social services, that led to large-scale retrenchments, that led to also to deindustrialization. So there was processes of debate within the left regarding economic policy, regarding the Reconstruction and Development Program, and within the trade union movement also there was a lot of contestation between sections of the left and what I would categorize, maybe you won't agree with me, what I would categorize as the right within the political establishment, within the trade unions, and a lot of these processes of contestation actually continued right up to the middle of the 2000s with mass expulsion of left forces from trade unions, in particular from trade unions. You know, I shouldn't say the social movements that basically arose later. So people like myself basically found ourselves either redeployed to some dusty corners of union offices or actually expelled for calling for the breaking of the alliance and calling for basically a return back to the kinds of promises that were made before 1994 in terms of both economic policy and also matters of political transition. So there's a sense in which the apartheid state and the ruling class basically shaped the kinds of policies that we find at the moment. And what we are beginning to see in South Africa is that by the structural adjustment program is adopted in 1996, but by 2007, within the ANC itself, it was becoming clear to sections of the ANC that the structural adjustment policies that have been adopted are not working, were not working for the majority of the people. In particular, for large sections of the black middle classes. You know, people had been waiting patiently for, in particular for, I think, sections of the black middle class, you know, who thought that, you know, the economic policy would allow them to basically climb the class ladder, you know, for themselves, to find themselves as joining the ranks of the big capitalist classes. But the kinds of policies that had been put forward by de Klerk in 1990 were beginning to forming a formidable barrier to the advancement, in particular of the middle classes, and also obviously the impoverishment of the working classes. I think that South Africa from 1994, when we had elections up to the present, we've had millions of workers losing their jobs, and we've had, I think, an unemployment rate that is approaching 50%. At the moment, it's standing at about 48% in terms of official statistics, which actually exclude what they call discouraged job seekers. Now, what we are beginning to see in South Africa with the go back to 2007 and the ANC, is that sections of the middle classes and the petty bourgeoisie within the ANC who really believed the radical language that was used at the time to sell structural adjustment policies began to ask questions about, you know, when are we going to see the the benefits of this freedom that we were promised. You know, where are we seeing all of this? So within the ANC, those tensions basically came to the fore in a conference of the ANC that became known famously as the Polokwane Conference in 2007. At that ANC conference, for the first time, the ANC recalled its president, who was then also president of the country. So Thabo Mbeki was recalled, and Jacob Zuma was basically thrust forward as deputy president of the ANC at the time, and he then took over as president. And I think that in terms of his social base, Jacob Zuma, for those of you who don't know, before he became thrust into the limelight, back into the limelight in 2007, he had faced various charges. I think he has, even now, about 783 charges against him of theft, corruption, racketeering, you name it. Also, more seriously, was that he had been on trial for rape. And during that trial, which he won through very expensive lawyers and through attacking the victim at the time, who passed away, unfortunately, I think last year or early this year. She finally passed away. Basically, what had happened during the various processes of charging Jacob Zuma, both through his rape trial and also some of his associates being arrested and sentenced to up to 15 years in prison, is that he relied a lot on a section, I think, of society which is very aspirational in its orientation, and he started using ethnic mobilization in his trial. Basically, you would see people walking around with t-shirt that says 100% Zulu boy, basically emphasizing the fact that he comes from Zululand and that his persecution has everything to do with his ethnicity rather than the fact that he's a prolific thief, essentially. So I think that there was a process of ethnic mobilization within the ANC, and also he began increasingly to rely on a section of, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal and also in Johannesburg and other areas of the community that had traditionally actually belonged to one of the Bantustan parties, which was called the IFP, Independent Inkatha Freedom Party. Now, the IFP was a notorious party within the homeland system. It was one political party that had a large mass base within apartheid, and it was an ultra-nationalist party. I would think, in my view, a very fascist kind of party that basically organized itself along ethnic lines, and was its social base, although it relied a lot on its very poor working class base, but in terms of its policies, its orientation, its office bearers, it was mostly people in the civil service within the homeland system, and also, I think, as aspirant business people, your small aspirant transport business owner, your taxi owners, your teachers, within the homeland system, which was a particular social layer within South Africa. And this is the layer that was actually brought in from the IFP into the ANC, after 1994, when the ANC started basically organizing itself and defeating electorally the IFP. It essentially took over that kind of constituency. And the IFP was also notorious in the 1990s because it was used by the apartheid state as a bulwark to basically attack popular organizations in communities. Now, one of the key issues that needed to be resolved under apartheid after de Klerk, I think 1990, announced the unbanning of political parties, is that there was an intractable problem that was going to make any settlement on the basis of a neoliberal policy impossible, which was the depth of organizing of working class communities that were in the country under apartheid. You had those organizations that were coming in from exile, but there was a depth of organization in the townships that was not very easy to shake. And I think traditions of democracy, traditions of struggle, and I think through a process both of deindustrialization of the country, throwing people into masses and masses of people into unemployment, but I think there was also an important process of unleashing unimaginable levels of violence after 1994. South Africa, between the period 1990, when did the violence start? Between 1991 and 1996, that's between 1990, that's the first incidents happened. Between 1990, I think, and up to around 1995, what came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is the fact that the state had organized paramilitary forces which were based on the Inkatha Freedom Party. These were the young people that were based in the homelands, that were trained in what was then the southwest of southwest of South Africa, what is then now Namibia. Some of them that were trained in parts of Angola. And these paramilitary forces were deployed in key areas of different townships, and they used the hostels, which were basically places where migrant men used to live when they were working in the cities. And they were basically dormitories, single-sex dormitories where workers were piled on concrete beds. So those were places mostly in Johannesburg where a lot of people from Zululand used to reside, and those were the places where the paramilitary forces were based. And we were basically at one stage counting deaths in the hundreds in between the transition period. So the South African transition was never this rainbow that is sold to the world, a peaceful transition. It was an entirely bloody transition because it was necessary to break those organizations that had very deep historical roots over a period of 30 years of unrelenting struggle. And those were places that were targeted for attacks. I was working in a trade union, and we would be dealing with about 10 companies basically coming in, retrenching workers on one side. And in the afternoon, we would have to deal with the fact that, the minute workers go into their taxis to go back into the townships, that the likelihood of some of the key shop stewards coming back alive the next day were actually very remote, because it could happen that the taxi would be attacked, on its way to the townships, or the people themselves would be attacked in their own homes. So there were unimaginable levels of violence that led to the weakening of those kinds of bonds within the townships. So those movements that had basically withstood the forces of apartheid over a period of time were essentially wiped out eventually. Besides the fact that legally speaking, the movements themselves were demobilized by the ANC. The UDF was basically incorporated into the ANC. The various independent youth movements were incorporated into the ANC Youth League. The various independent women's organizations were incorporated into the ANC Women's League. So we had a process where there was both physical elimination, I think, of an important layer of activists within society, the demobilization of their organizations, at the same time also their dislocation from society through the processes of retrenchment and unemployment. And as I'm saying, these processes continued up to, I think, recently. And I think that this is, in a sense, is the kind of background for me that helps explain, you know, why it is that we had in South Africa one of the most militant, democratic movements, social movements that arose in the middle of the most oppressive of systems that basically withstood all that the state could throw at them, you know, for 30 years. And then these organizations suddenly disappeared and never to be seen again. And so it was a multitude of these kinds of processes: physical elimination, ideological. I think also there's a Communist Party, the South African Communist Party, I think played a particularly important role in the political demobilization of large sections of workers. You also had their organizations, so people could no longer express themselves, you know, through in their organized formations. They had to go through the ANC with the kind of political culture and organizational culture from exile that it brought, which is not an open culture, which is not a democratic culture at all. And I think I would invite anyone who wants to read a little bit more about the ANC and its political culture. I'm hoping to find the book here, in which case I'll buy it. By Tim Ellis, the late Tim Ellis, The ANC in Exile, I think is a very important book that basically begins to lay out some of the key moments in the history of the ANC. You know, it begins to explain to us, those of us who didn't know at the time, now we know now. You know, some of the key leaders of the ANC were involved both in suppressing dissent, you know, in the military camps in Angola and other places, who were also involved, you know, through theft of supplies that were meant to go to soldiers. So the very same people with that kind of political culture then get to assume positions of authority, you know, in these organizations where, you know, where people thought, you know, what we thought we saw in these people was just a mirage. You know, that it was not really real. It's not something that was really there. So I think that from that period, from the 1990s up to, if I can say, up to the 2000s, if I can divide history into those kinds of arbitrary categories, is that we are seeing, in a sense, a process of demobilization of communities, as I was explaining. But also we begin to see processes of political change within the trade union movement, which was also a very important, I think, player in the anti-apartheid struggle. They were not alone. You know, in those periods when the trade union movement would decline, it was actually the youth in the township who would pick up the spear and run with it. You know, we were young. We were not employed, so we didn't care for anything. So if there was a strike, if we heard that there's a strike happening anywhere, you know, in our locality, we just knew exactly where to stand. If, for example, retail workers somewhere in a shop were on strike, by the afternoon we'd know that those people were on strike. We'd be waiting in the buses, waiting for people who are coming in from town, and we'd be searching their bags. You knew that there's a strike there. Why did you go and buy those things there? So those kinds of things we used to do. You know, we could carry on with those kinds of processes. We didn't care. Every weekend I was explaining to someone, you know, many of us are lucky to be alive because every weekend we would be burying someone. And during that process of burying that person, 3 more people, 4 more people, 5 more people will be shot by police. And we would be back the following weekend to basically bury that person. So we had no fear. So there's a sense in which even when the trade union movement was going through periods of difficulty, it was the townships, it was the youth in the townships that was carrying, you know, on with the struggle and reinforcing. So the struggle was reinforced from many sides. And it is that loss of that historical memory the memories of struggle, the memories of songs, the memories of people that were essentially killed, that died. That explains, in a sense, the depth of the collapse of the movement. So when people ask us, why is it that we're seeing, the rampant corruption that's going on, and we're not seeing the visible movements that we used to see in the anti-apartheid struggle, that's the explanation. But also I think it's important to note that from the 2000, although I spoke about the ANC and Polokwane in 2007, with factional battles breaking out, with a section of the ANC calling for Jacob Zuma to ascend to the throne so that they can confront the forces of monopoly capitalism, so that they could at least get a piece of the economic share. That was the hope of those sections of the ANC, and obviously that never happened. And by the time in 2013, and I'll explain why it happened in 2013 in particular, we began to see the fracturing of the ANC. The first political party that arose from the ANC is called the Congress of the People, as the ANC was unable to deal with these tensions of not being able to explain why it is that they cannot deliver any substantial change for people. On the other hand, they also had demands of the black middle classes that they could not deliver to. So by 2013, we begin to see processes of fracturing within the ANC, and the most significant of the political parties that arise from the ANC is a party called the Economic Freedom Fighters, led by the then leader of the Youth League of the ANC. But what also happened not in the ANC, outside of the ANC, we also began to see actually the rise of what was then very exciting new movements, which were not growing within the ANC. They were outside of the ANC, the Anti-Privatization Forum, the social movement in Daba. And those movements were linked quite strongly to the movements that arose in Seattle, and also had a lot of some of the key weaknesses of those movements in terms of the level of their implantation, in terms of the level at which they could train a new cadre, they could sustain their organizations. And by, I think, 2011, one of the greatest movements that had arisen then, the Anti-Privatization Forum, was dead, by 2011. And however, within the working class, as these movements rose and fell, within the working class itself, there are movements, spontaneous movements in South Africa that have been rising. It's just that they're not in the press, they're never reported anyway. But there are spontaneous eruptions all the time of instances where communities will basically protest about service delivery, about electricity, about water, about this and that. But these are the kinds of movements that don't actually have leaders. Anyone in the community can stand up and decide, look, we're tired of this, let's call a meeting together, and the community decides tomorrow we're marching, we're closing a highway, we're marching to this councillor. So we're finding these kinds of movements which are very episodic in nature, but still do not have, I think, the benefits of the historical memory of organizing, the traditions, the ideology, the depth of leadership and implantation that the movements of the 80s had, because that generation is gone in the township. It doesn't exist anymore. Now, in 2012, I think one of the most important, other than 1990, with the announcement of the unbanning of political organizations in 1996, the formal adoption of structural adjustment in South Africa, 2012 also represents, I think, a watershed moment in South Africa. This is when, for the first time, the democratic government is responsible for a massacre of its own people. That was the Marikana massacre. Now, the Marikana massacre is an important landmark in South Africa because it represents, for the first time, that people began to realize, particularly in the poor communities, within working class communities, that first of all, they cannot trust the state. Secondly, they cannot trust the ANC. Thirdly, they knew then that they cannot trust big business. And it was the beginning, in a sense, of a veil that was beginning to fall in front of people's eyes. You know, people were always protesting about the fact that, you know, we're not getting any of the benefits of freedom. And I think for the first time, this is an event that began to show people, you know, the connections between the various sections of society that were responsible for appropriating that freedom from them. And from 2013, this then allows the emergence of the economic freedom fighters who were still standing on this platform of the promises that were made by the ANC and Jacob Zuma in 2007. So what we're seeing today, those of you who follow some events, I think we're running out of time, so let me move on quickly. In South Africa to current events, is that there was, I was here in Canada, I was not there, but there was a march, I think one of the biggest marches so far that has been organized by the opposition parties on the 7th, was it this, when? Last week? Sorry, time has flown for me. I can't, concept of time when I'm jet lagged. Was it last week? Yes, 120,000 people who were gathered in front of the Union building. Now, what is happening in South Africa is that these tensions between sections of the ANC that have basically been incorporated into big business, in particular the current deputy president of the ANC, who is also incidentally the one person who has the smoking gun in the Marikana massacre. There's an email from him writing to government, to the Minister of Police, demanding concomitant action, what he called concomitant action, to deal with the fact that mine workers were on strike for a living wage and were refusing to retreat. And because of that email, basically it unleashed processes where paramilitary police forces were called, and it basically led to the death of the 24 mine workers. So there is a section within the ANC represented by what was then the finance minister, Pravin Gordhan, represented by people like Cyril Ramaphosa, who have very strong links to big business, who were basically the people that were responsible for ensuring that all the policies of fiscal discipline, the policies of structural adjustment are maintained within the state. And I think that Jacob Zuma still represents that section of the ANC, of the small black middle, sorry, I shouldn't say the small, they're not small in number, but of the black middle classes who basically couldn't break through, you know, those barriers that had been set up by the Constitution to accumulate, you know, and to survive. So the only other form of survival they have is the state. So the first thing they did was to capture the state, and basically to intervene at that level of state where the state is dispersing basically whatever surplus has been accumulated in society to the working class. So social grants, monies for social grants, monies for service delivery, monies for housing, substandard housing. So that is the layer that Jacob Zuma organizes, that has basically been the one that has been most active, you know, in terms of a lot of the corruption currently that we see. But I think that it's important to see that whilst the narrative in the media is of Pravin Gordhan and Cyril Ramaphosa and the other oligarchs who are essentially billionaires now, a lot of them, are basically presented as people that are for responsible and clean governance. It is important to realize that these are the same people that were the managers of structural adjustment within South Africa. So it is them that implemented all the policies that led to the impoverishment of a large parts of the population, and also of creating those extreme levels of poverty and wealth within South Africa. So I think that what we're facing here is that we have one section of the ANC which represents, in a sense, big business, and also the interests of, they have an interest in protecting, you know, all the infrastructure of accumulation as far as big business is concerned. You have on the other side, particularly the small black middle classes who are relying on the state basically to accumulate because they can't get over all these other forms of protection in order to accumulate. But what has changed, I think, within that section of society is the emergence of a family of black capitalists who also happen to be from India. They are called the Guptas. Now, the Guptas managed to accumulate, like all other ultra capitalists, managed to accumulate a lot of wealth in a very short space of time. But what is different about the Guptas to what Zuma and all the other black middle classes were doing is that I think they actually move on the terrain of productive capital, their own minds, which produce. They have the capacity, therefore, to organize in a way that Zuma doesn't. You know, Zuma has always been a petty thief, and it's just that he's thieving on a large scale, you know, of millions. but in terms of his, you know, you only need to listen to his speeches. You know, when he reads, he's very halting. You know, he's not fluent as a reader, but if you allow him to speak off the cuff, you know, that's when you see the man, you know, himself with his misogyny, with his racism, with his attacks also against the black middle classes, the upper layers of the black middle classes that he calls the clever blacks, as opposed to himself. I mean, his latest one was that black people don't have stress because he doesn't have any stress. so it's nice to live in a 244 million rand house that has been built on workers' pensions, you know, and say I don't have any stress. And probably it's true. You know, the only stress he has is the stress of the fact that, yeah, he seems assured that the 783 charges are not going to come. So there's sort of a stalemate, a lot of court cases that are currently going on from sections of civil society to try and deal with some of those processes. But I think that the entry of the Guptas, who, in my view, are no longer the small business people, they are playing in the terrain of big capital. And one of the problems they also have is that that white business have actually formed this wall. They can't break through, you know, to basically accumulate the kinds of profits, you know, that historically white business have been able to, because, you know, the big business in South Africa control the banks, which means they can steal from the middle classes, such as yourselves and me, you know, through banks, you know, through all sorts of other services. So the point is that you have this layer of Zuma, which is only accumulating at the level of the state and the local state, and there's a limitation to the extent to which they can accumulate wealth. Then you have the Guptas, on the other hand, who are really playing at the terrain of productive capital. And they are also finding it difficult to basically enter into that space, which is really being protected constitutionally and otherwise by rating agencies and others. So I think that what we're having in South Africa is a kind of a stalemate, you know, of the traditional white capitalist class, together with a few of its black attendants who have managed to become billionaires. And interestingly enough, I must say that the difference between the Guptas and Cyril Ramaphosa, Pravin is not a billionaire. He's an honest capitalist, you know. But the point about them is that they made their wealth through the stock market, whilst the Guptas, as I'm saying, really play in the terrain of accumulation, of owning mines. You know, they want to own a bank. They want to, I'm sure eventually they'll own an insurance company so that they can accumulate properly like all the other big bourgeoisies are able to accumulate. So they are able to use, in particular, Zuma and his coterie of thieves, in their quest, to basically battle against the battlements that have been put forward by the Constitution to get to the real spaces where there is real wealth, being accumulated. So, and I think that they've resorted to going back to the language of the past of, monopoly capitalism. The white people don't want us to accumulate. So they've gone back to that kind of language. And I think that what is beginning to happen with the EFF and its march was that initially a lot of the marches against corruption were mostly, I think, a response both by the political party that was white became black, which is the Democratic Alliance, a very interesting political party, which organized a few thousand of its members to protest against Zuma. But with the entry of the EFF, is that the EFF as a party, I think, was able to organize almost exclusively its own members, although it was called it was a march for all political parties. But if you look at the photographs, you'll see a sea of red, and those are activists of the economic freedom fighters. And that is a section of the working class. So I think that for the first time with the march to the Union Building, we began to saw the working class itself, beginning to concern itself with these in a sense, with this battle between the middle class of Zuma's type and the big bourgeoisie on top. But for the large sections of the working class, I think for reasons that I've explained of historical memory, of destruction of the organizations, is that they have not yet been able to enter into that space. So I think politically in South Africa, we're in a situation where there's a logjam between the two contending classes, and it's not clear which one is going to overcome. The Guptas have the organizational machinery of the ANC. They've got the levers of the state, as to use as battering rams to get into those spaces. Whilst the other side is basically concerning itself with issues of corruption, rightly so, and the theft, naked theft, of all the surplus, the little surplus that is given by society to the working class, which is essentially being stolen away. But maybe I should stop there. I'm sorry, I could talk for another few hours. But yeah, just to say maybe one last thing. I know some people wanted me to speak on the left. What does it mean for the left for me? I think that what all these processes mean for the left is that, first of all, I think the left in South Africa, and I'm not counting the Communist Party as in any way, shape or form as part of those left forces. There are, organizations in civil society, political parties, is that they have essentially since some of them from the 80s, because they are all comrades of mine, some of them from the 1990s and later, have been pursuing this idea of the trade unions, as possibly forces for change. The first they pursued COSATU, then COSATU threw out NUMSA, and now they are busy with NUMSA. They think maybe NUMSA possibly is the agent that will allow for the emergence of less forces. I'm not in agreement with that perspective. I think that the solution to this crisis, which I think is a stalemate at the moment between two forces within society, certainly lies within the working class entering into that terrain, but that it will take very different conceptions and very different tools to what the left actually uses to recognize the fact that the trade unions are not any longer those forces for change that they used to be, and that the forces for change actually are those sections of the working class that struggle to organize themselves, that march every week, whose marches are never publicized. And I think that those, for me, are possibly the forces for change. And maybe later, over tea, we can talk about why I think how I think it will happen. Thank you.